China's ambassador to Australia has delivered a rare public address setting the scene for relations between the two countries in the new year. Political reporter Cameron Redden was there. Cam, in terms of the message, it's usually not a particularly subtle one, at least from the ambassador here in Australia. What did you take out of today?
I think the big overarching theme of this, Tom, was a new chapter once again, the turning of a new page, the moving on from stabilisation in relations between Australia and China. That's been the message, or the theme, if you like, of the last 18 months particularly, restoring some of the ground that might have been lost in previous years, stabilising those relations, and now turning to the next chapter, what it looks like once those relations are stabilised. It was a marathon 2-hour affair with many questions being fielded by the Australian media inside the Chinese embassy. We can show you some of the key takeaways, I think, throughout the course of those 2 hours. I mentioned there the theme of a new chapter, moving on from stabilisation. We learned today that there's no yet further progress on tariffs. We know that there's an ongoing review into wine as well as lobster and beef sanctions that remain. There was a line from the ambassador today that the Chinese naval ship in November did not use a sonar pulse, which there are reports that Australian divers were injured as a result of that. The ambassador today claims that that sonar pulse was not deployed. It did not happen. There was commentary around Dr. Yang Henjun, the Australian who remains in detention in China, noting the ambassador arguing that his condition of his health is not as serious as some of the family members have said, but also touching prominently on this theme that Australia and China can cooperate in the Pacific. And the ambassador making the observation today that even though there are differences in the way that Australia and China might approach many different things, he says that doesn't mean that those differences should hijack the broader relationship.
We are ready to work together with Australia in this year to continue the good momentum. And based on this, we expect something more. Move beyond stabilization, move beyond improvement, and move towards further development of our bilateral relationship. We can manage the differences in a way that these differences will not hijack our overall relationship.
I expect a resolution that will allow for wine to be back into China very soon. That is in Australia's interest, but it's also in China's interest. You know why? Because it's bloody good wine.
So the Prime Minister's setting the bar there. It has to be a breakthrough, basically, which has been the indication for a while, but would be interesting if that did not happen. On the foreign relations aspect, I mean, as much as we can have talk of cooperating in the Pacific, clearly there's a sort of, soft diplomacy battle here. When we look at Nauru as the most recent example, where Australia wants to influence Pacific nations to be turning to Australia, not China. So as much as things might appear to be cosier in public, privately, that battle is well and truly on.
And it's such a contest for funding as well, Tom. A lot of the talk amongst these Pacific nations is that, well, if Australia doesn't give X amount of money, then perhaps China might. And that then becomes a position of contention within Pacific nations. And then, therefore, that relates and feeds into the challenge for both nations of how they deal with each other in the Pacific. I put that question to the ambassador today about how Australia's role in the Pacific and China's role and ambitions in the Pacific can interrelate.
Pacific Island countries is an area where China and Australia can cooperate and can contribute together instead of asking them to choose between the two. And there's no need for any so-called anxiety on the part of Australia. It's a question of trust and confidence.
When he was speaking around going beyond stabilisation, I mean, we've sort of moved beyond that already towards, I suppose, normalisation. And one of those aspects, resuming the annual dialogues between the Premier in China, 2IC, let's call them, and Australia's Prime Minister.
Yeah, those dialogues resuming last year, they'll happen now on an annual basis between the Prime Minister of Australia and the Premier of China. And I had the chance to, after this speech today, pull the ambassador aside for a couple of minutes and ask him about the nature of those discussions, as well as the nature and the importance of face-to-face time. We know about Anthony Albanese's trip to Beijing last year being so important because it was the first time an Australian leader had ventured to Beijing in 7 years since Malcolm Turnbull in 2016. So I asked him about the significance of FaceTime, but also of continued face-to-face dialogue between Australia and China to make sure that the progress that's been made is sustainable and it continues over the longer term.
How do you see, I suppose, the new dialogue between the Australian Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier contributing to long-lasting, sustainable, positive relations?
I think there are many opportunities for us to have that to happen. One is on multilateral occasions, and bilaterally there's also good potential of exchange of visits. Australian side has invited Chinese leader to visit Australia this year. And also, the Chinese side has also extended invitation to Australian leaders to visit China. We will communicate with our Australian side through diplomatic channels as to who, when, how we're going to have that exchange of visits.
I think the mood's always interesting at these briefings. I remember going to one where essentially the media was being told all the incorrect reports we'd been talking about on the Uyghurs, and it was frosty at best. There were strong tellings off. It seemed a bit more upbeat. Chinese New Year's not far away as well. I think that starts in, 4 days? Was it a bit more of a positive vibe in there, if you like?
If you're asking me about the vibe, Tom, I've got to say there was a little bit of hugging and backslapping as we were greeted walking in. Okay. The air conditioning was beautiful in there. There was a lovely spread of food. The spicy beans were quite nice. So it was pretty good. I've had a lot worse in hotels, so... No, the catering was right up there, I'd say. You would have enjoyed the beans. They were very good.
I think we had tea and some dry biscuits last time, so clearly it was a bit more of a charm offensive this time. Cam Redden, thank you.
Thank you.